out of time. So good morning, everybody. Thank you all 21 of you who are on time, and we'll just get going here. My name is Geshi Kururi Sabina. I'm an associate at the South African Cities Network and a visiting fellow at the Wits School of Governance. And I have with me here Joe Ravitz, who's our main speaker for today. I've known Joe for a few years, first met him in Bellagio at a session where I got to experience both his skill and his humor, but also his deep engagement in urban work. He's a co-director of the Collaboratory on Urban Resilience and Energy at the University of Manchester. I actually thought that what I would do instead of read long bios is also just use this nice little chat feature here. Oh, I can't actually, I have to remember. Oh, yes, I can. I can put links here. I'll use links here, and I'll invite any of the speakers to give their better links if they'd like. I'm going to give Joe's link that goes along with his latest new book, which he'll be speaking about today in part, Deeper Cities. His previous book, City Region 2020, and another, Environment and City, which are all great reads. I encourage you to see those. And I'm really glad that he's able to be with us today, just because I think his particular way of approaching urban work and participation in urban thinking is quite exciting and maybe in some ways useful for us as we contemplate similar issues here. And so thank you, Joe, for being with us. Just briefly to also introduce then our panel members, and it's an odd panel. This isn't sort of the usual long speaking panel that we normally have at events. This is really just some friends and thinkers who we've invited to help, in a way, internalize and reflect from our context on some of what Joe will be sharing with us. And so we've got Professor Amira Osman from Tshwane University of Technology, who's also a Sarchi Chair on Spatial Transformation, a friend and part of the South African Cities Network family as well. So welcome, Amira, and thank you for being here. We've also got Siwe Ntombela, who is a researcher in the Built Environment Program at South African Cities Network, and importantly has been managing SACN's Visualization Studios initiative. And so we thought it would be really great to hear some of her ideas and reflection on Joe's work. And then last but not least, Nosipho Hlatshwayo, who's the Executive Director for City Strategies and Performance at the City of Tshwane. One might call her the boss of South African Cities Network in some ways, and really glad to have her here to share with us from a practitioner's perspective. So that's the crowd up here. Perhaps without too much further ado, because we want to get into the goodies that brought us here, just to acknowledge all of you participants who have joined us and made the time. We hope today will be an exciting and interactive session, so we encourage you to participate actively. As the webinar Zoom platform works, I hope you're all aware, you're kind of not really able to speak. If you're an attendee, you're sort of auto-muted. But we do encourage you to use the Q&A feature that should be on your bottom toolbar on your Zoom interface. And that allows you to do a couple of things. It allows you to post questions at any time throughout the session. It also allows you to like or sort of thumbs up other people's questions. And that's a really good way to add emphasis to questions people are asking that you'd also like to hear about. So please feel free to use that. Yes, okay, Samantha's just reminding us that we can actually allow you to speak. We'll see about that. No, I'm joking. We will let you speak if you'd like to. So just send a chat. Use the chat box, not so much for questions and answers, but just to, if there are technical issues or you want to ask something that's not really about the content, I think then feel free to use the chat. But please, as far as you can, do use the main Q&A feature. I'm going to pause there, partly because my husband is speaking in the background, in spite of the fact that I told him I was hosting a session. So I'm going to mute myself now and just invite Joe to share with us. We've provocatively themed today a session, Pandemic City 3.0, not because we're trying to wish that or be over dramatic, but just because it's one of the themes that we picked out of his book that we thought was a useful provocation. And so, Joe, I'd just like to hand over to you. And I think for the first few minutes here, we'll be hearing about your thoughts on the issue. So, Joe, welcome.
Okay, thank you, Jeshi. So thank you everybody for coming, and thanks for hosting me. And I'll just say, This is, I'm very honoured. This is the first of a whole series of launches of this book. And well, what is a book these days? It's a piece of paper, really. But you know what? Why this is, I think, significant, certainly for me and everybody that I work with, is that it represents 10 years or more of thinking, drawing, debating, exploring, and so on and so on. I won't talk about my CV now, but I will just jump straight into the presentation. Can you give me the screen, someone? Hello?
I think Sadhna, I think Joe needs to share his screen. Joe, you should be able to. You're a panelist, so if you just click on your share screen.
Okay, I don't quite see where I would share the screen actually from here. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, on your bottom.
Green button,
Yeah.
the fourth one.
There is no green button on my system here. Do I have to transition to being a panelist?
You are a panelist, Joe, so you should be able to, on your menu where you see the Q&A, the chat, participants, there should be a share screen.
Sorry.
Otherwise, you can use Alt-S.
Alt-S. No, there's no screen coming up. No share screen thing.
That's very strange.
Yeah.
You can email the presentation to Sadhna, and Sadhna, you're the host. You can upload it. You can share the screen.
That's fine. Yeah. Joe, would you like to email me your presentation, please?
Well, I put it on the Dropbox link. The only problem is it's quite interactive. It's much better if I run it from.
Okay.
All right.
So maybe, shall I leave and re-enter?
Sorry, Sadhna. Siwa
Yes.
is mentioning that Joe actually isn't a panelist. Maybe that's why he can't see it. Could you just see whether you've made him a
Alright.
panelist? Yeah, actually, he's still on as an attendee. I think that's the issue.
All right.
I'll just say, everybody here, while we are sorting out this technology, you know, it took me a while to get used to the idea that I was never going to meet anybody ever again. And how could I communicate? How could I debate? How could we, you know, address these really huge challenges? And then I realized, okay, well, maybe actually there are some advantages. I can, you know, turn up in Joburg with very little CO2 and no hassle in airports and hotels and so on. And also we can, you know, bring in a wide variety of people from a whole number of places. So for me,
Sorry, Joe, I don't know. Kamantha, are you able to assist? We just need to upgrade Joe. Does he need to be muted first?
Just give me a second.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that seems to have worked. Sorry, attendees. I'm sure you're used to this by now, but hopefully this won't carry on for much longer. Okay, I think we're good now. Joe, you're good?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we can see his screen now. Perfect.
Oh, we can't hear you though, Joe.
So, okay, we're online. You can hear,
Perfect.
you can see me. And can you see my screen? Great. Okay, ready to roll. This is all about using the pandemic to turn crisis into opportunity. And what I'm putting on the table is some thoughts and preliminary experiments and experiences with collective intelligence. And the best way that I have found personally to get into that is by visual thinking. So you will see there is quite a bit of visual thinking going on here. I'm hoping I don't overload everybody. I may kind of jump a little bit, but you know, I'm sure you will get the idea. If anyone wants to catch up on the pictures afterwards, they're very welcome. High quality prints can be supplied if necessary, and so on. So I'll start with a prologue where these ideas are coming from. I'll say a few words about current adventures into the pandemic city, and the concept of games, the concept of pathways. Then we talk about some applications in cities, economies, well, very briefly on economies, political systems and governance, which is always a huge tangle of everything, and a couple of words about the local global aspects. And then really to wrap up and say, okay, so what do we do? Are there pathways or are there next steps? Just to introduce my clients here on the right, and also some new clients I have in Ghana, where my student is now researching all this. The prologue, well, here's me. My name's Joe, by the way, and I'll say a couple of words about where this is coming from. So in the 1980s, everybody was arguing, is it the climate, is it governance, is it the economy? And then this word sustainability came up. This is really 1992. This offered the opportunity, or at least the aspiration, to bring all these things together. So I suddenly kind of dropped everything I was doing and jumped into the sustainability swimming pool, and I've been kind of swimming around ever since. But then we set up a research centre, Centre for Urban and Regional Ecology, as it was. And we did a lot of research on all the things, the energy, the land use, the housing, the transport, the biodiversity, and so on. And then I tried to put this into practice, traveling around many countries, many cities, to say, okay, so let's do it. And all the time, and more, I became aware of blockages. Eventually it kind of dropped, oh yeah, actually we have to talk about not only things, but thinking. Sounds kind of, simplistic, but that kind of sums it up. And then many questions come up, like how to draw thinking. It's not so straightforward. And then we say, okay, the main question is huge. And now this little picture here, I think she was there about 10 or 12 years ago with the Rockefeller Foundation. And I was the artist at the time. So I drew this picture in response to what somebody said. And then we put it up in the exhibition at the end, and the Rockefeller people came round. Is there anybody here from Rockefeller, by the way? And they said, well, I'm not sure about this one. Our sponsors might get a little iffy about this one. Could you please put it round the back, So this kind of summed up some of the issues that we have. And then, of course, we say, well, technically, it's unlikely that we can all live like the rich or even the middle class. Maybe there is the technology, but we have no idea how to organize an economic system, a governance system, a technology system, and so on, where all these things can work together. So again, it's back to the thinking, the collective intelligence of cities, economies, societies, political systems, and so on. So we're all beginners in this. What I did then start to realize was, yeah, we have to then kind of draw some lines, and even we start to draw how things work inside the brain of an individual, like mine, and then how things work inside the brain of a society. And here you see, clever thinking works for, technical problems. We all need technical solutions for these things, but on a society scale, we tend to end up with a very simplistic kind of system, as you can see. Then we go to smart thinking, and well, smart is one of these buzzwords, but we can look at the patterns that seem to evolve and say, well, okay, people can be very clever, but also very selfish. Corporations can make, trillions of dollars, but they can also cause, global climate change and increasing inequality, and so on and so on. So what lies beyond? This is the huge trillion-dollar question. And well, I think I could spend a lifetime now trying to draw this or understand it. And, as I said, we're all beginners, but we have some clue as to where we are heading. And then we can start to play it out on cities, on economies, and say, what's the difference between an economy which rips everybody off and trashes everything around it, and an economy which recirculates, which respects people, which is in harmony with its surroundings, and so on. So that's the kind of starting point. Then we throw in this little virus thing. And well, this is one of a series of games on one of their websites, and you're very welcome to check them out. And the point of this line of thinking was to say, well, things tend to multiply up. And what this virus appears to be doing, certainly in this part of the world, is to amplify all of the cracks and fractures and tensions and conflicts within societies. There is also maybe another kind of possibility. We'll come back to that. So in this one, well, this is just a little thought process, racial conflict, rigged elections in the USA, counterinsurgencies, migration is out of control, climate chaos kicks in, whole cities and nations fall to pieces. This is entirely plausible. In fact, even in little old UK, we have a government scenario which is not unlike this. And in our case, we have a little Brexit factored also to throw into the mix. So then we have a kind of opposite case, positive synergies, sustainable food, sustainable energy, bioscience, meshwork economies, individual empowerment and realization. Wonderful. But we also find it's not only about things, it's about thinking. And in this case, it seems we have a virus in our own minds, or collectively, yeah, we have some kind of thing going on, which is driving everybody, many people crazy on a collective basis, without getting into politics right now. So then the huge question is, okay, so who can turn this crisis into opportunity? How can they do this? So, well, a couple of words about, the city under pandemic conditions. And this is all work in progress. We could say, take a long look and say, well, maybe this virus is kind of taking things to pieces. If we were a scientist, well, some of us here are scientists and academics, you take things to pieces. That's how you understand them, under our microscope. So this virus is now taking our city or our society to pieces. And it's very interesting to see what happens. And in this little picture, we see, oh, here's a city. It's falling to pieces, but it doesn't just kind of fall to pieces in an orderly fashion. Everybody involved has their own game to play. And some of these games are rich and powerful. Some of them are very small, almost microscopic size, and others are excluded and marginal. And well, you get the kind of idea that all these games kind of intersect in the city. Now, then I thought at this time, well, I was just preparing to publish this book, and the publisher said, oh, there's a virus, but who cares? Let's just go ahead. So I thought, oh no, this is really bad. 10 years work will be wasted because, so the idea of a series of games came up, the Corona-Games. And in this case, it represented a line of foresight thinking, which has been cooking up over the years, which is to say, well, you can get a bunch of experts in a room and you can fill up whiteboards and so on. But until you get them, or hopefully other people too, really engaged and excited about something, then it's all a bit tame and polite and still inside the box. So what do I get worked up about? Well, I play games sometimes. And everyone here plays some kind of games, not always formal games, but you play games with people, games with words, and so on and so on. So let's see how this game thing works. So anyway, this particular series started to play with the pandemic thing in the sense of games as a way to explore the possibilities, and particularly to explore how people work and how they interact. Well, first, we put up a picture and said, okay, let's imagine different alternative futures. And in one type of future, the pandemic is solved, great, we have a vaccine and so on. And in another, but what if it's not solved? It ongoes, it mutates, it recurs and so on. And in one sense, on the vertical scale, we could say, oh, what if society makes this transition into something which we all aspire to. And in another sense, what if it doesn't? What if things pull back? So then you see 4 different corners. And actually this little picture got very popular at the time. It was the most famous I've ever been, actually, I think, on LinkedIn. And somehow kind of, people said, oh yeah, look, that's us, that's our neighborhood there on the top left. That's what we want to do. We want to have street parties and kids playing in the street. And okay, maybe there's a kind of security van in the background, just checking, but you know, we can have a great time. And then the question is, oh, what if we live in a Zoom world of bubbles and decontamination, and you know, and nobody can actually talk to anyone except online? Well, life will go on somehow, and so on. And then, of course, the really scary dystopian things start to happen below, where you have the business as usual, let's go shopping, or much worse things, which you see now in maybe a quarter of the countries around the world. We're heading towards a kind of bottom right scenario. So, well, then we can play with this and get into a whole set of, so what if, you know, and look at this city. It's dividing into zones of safety and value. High value, high safety, low value, high safety, high value, low safety. That's the old people's homes, I have to say. If you want to, you know, get rid of your elderly relatives in this country, sorry, no offense to anyone, speaking as a senior myself, you put them in an old people's home, they get the virus, and that's that. I'm being kind of blunt here, but this is how it is. And then the low value, low safety, unfortunately, this is where the workers live, the bus drivers, the nurses, and so on. So this is how our city here is shaping up. I don't know about your city in much detail, but I can imagine similar things. So then we say, okay, what is this safety and danger thing? Sorry for the overload on this diagram. I'll say that now. This was one attempt to say, okay, let's kind of go around the city, you and me. We're a bit nervous, but you know, can we go around the city into these zones of danger in the center, the red colors, and each time find some way of existing in the zones of safety, the green color around the edge. We can even start to invent a whole new discipline, safeonomics. Yeah, we could get a professorship in safeonomics, and so on. And of course, all kinds of wacky ideas come up. Only a few months after this was done, then the news, you know, some architects are doing some of these things already. So great, you know, it's a very fast moving picture. And then, okay, what about the overall city? How do we live under new conditions of disturbanism, so to say? We used to all hang out in bars, now we've got to hang out at some distance. We used to go to college and university. This is Manchester, by the way, on the left. Now we go to a Zoom university. We might as well just sit at home in our boxes, order stuff from Amazon, and hope that somehow or other things will work out. And of course, for many, many people, they don't. They're homeless, they're hungry, certainly in this country. So we have to ask some pretty hard questions and say, okay, can we systematically start to track the interactions, the threat multipliers between these different things, which add up to a pandemic nexus where things get really, really bad, or maybe worse than that. And these are some, you know, this is just like a little, you know, flip chart written down. These are some of the things where we can start to say, oh, what if this adds up to that? And what if that overlaps onto the other thing? And so on and so on. There's one bit of good news. The CO2 emissions went down, but only very temporarily. And then, big question, how can we then track over to, from a nexus of problems to a connexus of positive synergy, where each of these circles has opportunities which are already there, if we only knew how to put them together. Even right now, our government in little old UK is doing more socialism than in half a century of left-wing thinking, simply, you know, to save 10 million jobs and save the economy from certain death, and so on. So all kinds of stuff is bubbling up. But my big fear is, and I'm sure this is maybe shared, yeah, you know, the forces will pull us back, you know, power, money. This is what we know how to do. This is the business model. And sorry, guys, you have to be homeless now because, you know, there's no alternative. So it's you know, an existential conflict. We need everything we can get now. Well, sorry, the funny animation. Then we start to say, okay, so what games are people playing in order to achieve either the one on the left or the one on the right? And on the left here, you see, oh, here is a board of directors. They're all masked up, obviously, because they have to sit in a boardroom. They're going crazy with Zooms and so on. And they want to raise their share value and keep their business going. So they have a great solution. Yeah, let's, you know, create total life-death insurance with total tracking, neural implants, and so on and so on. So you can systematically say, okay, these guys are healthy, those guys are goners, you know, so now we know what to do. I'm exaggerating, but this is what is going on, you know, in some parts of this country and many others. And then we say, okay, is there an opportunity for transformation on the right-hand side? How can we grow this deeper and wider prosperity? Do we need different kinds of thinking, different kinds of, or do we need to cultivate the seeds of economic livelihood, of social mutual aid, and so on? And then if we know how to cultivate those seeds, then we can get them to grow. So again, existential conflicts, one side to the other. Well, a word about the applications. And well, this is a long, long story. Even the book is hardly even a kind of a beginning, but you know, it's too long anyway, but you get the idea. So we start off with the neighborhood, where everyone is a stranger, and you cannot cross the road, children are at risk from crime, and so on. The school have to be like prisons because there is a security threat, monofunctional land uses, deprived housing projects, and so on. Everything goes wrong, which can go wrong. I'm sure we have all known, or we all know, neighborhoods like this. And then we say, okay, is there an alternative? Now, this is where, in my view, we have to be careful, because a lot of, you know, designers, architects, and so on, maybe there's some architects here today. I was once an architect, actually. They said, oh, let's just draw a nice neighborhood. We're full of trees where, you know, everybody's happy and the sun is always shining, and so on. And I've drawn these pictures myself, you know, in order to get the job. And okay, so everything's fine. Everybody is welcome around here. And of course, this is much more than the, you know, arrangement of buildings and streets and so on. It's really about the people. But of course, the buildings and streets are very instrumental to that. So then we say, okay, can we get any more analytical about the people and how they interact? And here we have a picture of the spaces of strangers, all in their own compartments. There is very little means to interact on the left-hand side. And on the right, we have what we might call spaces of connections. Everything is helping people to make positive connections. And on the left, we have, you know, a map of the actors. They're all floating about at random. On the right, we have a map of the actors in networks, circles, mutual aid groups, and so on and so on. And of course, you know, this is very, very, very simplistic, but this is the start of a journey. And then we say, okay, what about the pathways? Is there anything we can say about how to get from the left to the right? Even at this very, very rough level of generality and so on. So the task which I and colleagues began on was say, okay, can we be systematic about these pathways? If we identify the gaps, can we then identify the pathway which somehow or other achieves system change to bridge those gaps? Now, this is a long, long story, but this is the first kind of take on it. And well, then we scale up a little bit and say, okay, actually our city or city region is changing. And we used to have an industrial city region. Here are the factories, here are the houses, here are the shops, and that was about it. Now we have something like a post-industrial city region. Things are much more complex. A lot of stuff is consumption-based, retail, culture, logistics, and so on. We have a big CBD, obviously. And by the way, we need a new ring road on this one. So these slums over here, they have to go, sorry. And this is the story the world over. And then we say, oh, is there an alternative to this almost out of control, sprawling post-industrial city region where the slums always have to move and so on? Yeah, well, maybe this is what we have to imagine. And well, I spent my early career on the sustainable city region. And again, I began to realize, well, we can all draw nice diagrams and maps and say, oh, let's have, nice things. But until we get to the thinking part, yeah, it's very hard to make things work. And not to say, yeah, there is great progress in all kinds of ways all around the world. But we're still, struggling to get really, the transformation that we were all looking for. A very brief aside. We have this project which Joe Berg is involved with in some way on the peri-urban. Now this presentation is not about the peri-urban and it's not particularly about the climate change, but this is just stuff which comes out looking at Gauteng and the urban growth from 1970 to 1990 to 2000 and now to 2015. So what we're trying to do is to get a handle on this kind of pattern of peri-urban growth, which in my view is one of the keys to understanding the city. You have to look at where it's happening on the frontier out there. That's another long story for another time. There is another workshop in November if anyone is interested to join. So back to the main agenda today. Well, if we were trying to get this beautiful neighborhood and this synergistic city region, again, we have to say, well, this is not just about, drawing stuff on a nice plan. It's about the process of decision making, priority setting, agenda setting. And again, on the left, we have stuff which may be very clever and smart. By the way, I started my career just in front of that bulldozer on the top left in inner city London in the 1970s. And this was roughly what was going on. And developers had to build, machine-like buildings to maximize their profits. And it's not that they were evil necessarily. That was the game that they were playing, and that's what their shareholders set them up to do, and they know how to do it. So that was how it worked. And again, you have to say, okay, is there an alternative? And in this one, we say, oh, well, at the time, we were using this method on the right here called planning for real, which is basically one way to put citizens at the center in charge of the process to work out what they want and how to do it, roughly. And then you go back to the land use mix and the infrastructure and so on, and you say, okay, well, this may lead to a rather different kind of plan. One which is made more for humans, by humans, rather than made by machines for profit. Now, this does raise some rather big questions. Again, well, then we can say, okay, if we are systematic about this, we can start to track out the relations between everybody around the table. And of course, particularly we have to talk about the people who are excluded. They are not allowed in the room. They don't have degrees, or they are, squatters or whatever. So this suddenly gets very, very political, which is not to say, oh, now we know what the answer is going to be. Let's, abolish capitalism and start a whole new utopia. Well, yeah, maybe, but, this is probably out of scope for today and tomorrow. So we have to say, yeah, what is in scope? What can be done? And in this case, well, possibly this is what we might aspire to, which is say, well, we get as many people as we can around the table in this planning for real setup or some similar thing. And we look at how they might work together. Not all together, but one by one, and say, okay, so maybe the government people could do some kind of arrangement with the landlords and with the designers and with the infrastructure, and maybe the social housing people could do some deal with the finance, where it's mutualized finance to do, and that then takes a stewardship arrangement on the land, and then they can organize their own infrastructure, and so on and so on. In other words, no matter how bad the situation, there is always some way to look for opportunities on the right-hand side. And then once we have those opportunities kind of defined and clear, then we could look at the pathways. And these are simply those red, green, and blue loops, then translated into a process where we can say, okay, let's get together a subgroup with, the finance, the landlords, the agents, and the residents. Or let's get together another subgroup with the citizens, the ecologists, the farmers, and so on. And once you have these subgroups to cook up what works for them, then you go back and say, okay, let's check that all these can work together. So this is kind of common sense, and it's nothing actually so new. It's been going on for thousands of years, in the sense that people have always done deals, made arrangements, and usually, society kind of moves forward. Hopefully, sometimes it moves back, but generally we try to move forward. So, well, a very quick word about the livelihood, which really reflects what we saw about the spatial form. And again, we start with an industrial city. It's a bit vulnerable because, the jobs might migrate. We then move to a post-industrial city, and that is dynamic, booming, and the CBD is all very shiny, but has massive negative impacts, as we can all see. And then we ask the question, what if we kind of designed a city where everybody has a livelihood? That is the starting point, and then we work back from there. Now, this is radical utopianism. It's also what even right-wing think tanks are trying to do these days. So, well, we can't just let these people lie around, and we can't have them dying on the streets. What can we do? So, amazing how these, radical ideas kind of come full circle. And this is my personal challenge at the moment, is to get traction with a quite right-wing government in the UK. That's another kind of story. So then we have to get into more about the politics. And, well, this one looks like a scenario. And we could say, okay, we have in one corner a global community. This is very much like the EU, the European Union. And on the other corner, we have the big corporates. And in another corner, we have the small enterprises and, people who just want to make a few bucks. And in another corner, we've got people who just want to have control in their own community. And the reason I put this here is to illustrate the tensions and stresses on any political debate. Now, again, long story. This kind of thinking is at the moment in use for a European-funded project, which is looking at how to get regions around Europe to do sustainability transitions. And again, well, the technology people and the kind of science people is like, oh yeah, they could, get some new technology in here. That would be good. And then the reality people, meaning policymakers, say, well, sorry, no, this is really not going to work because, we've got people pulling. You've got the big corporates pulling one way, got the local communities pulling in an opposite direction. Meanwhile, the business anti-political people are easily, captured by political, extremism. And if we assume that we are the European Union and therefore, everybody will see the wisdom of our ways, then I think this assumption is really not going to work. So this is one way to start mapping and understanding the forces at work, which then, if we are serious about making stuff really happen, we have to deal with. Well, then we say, okay, if we solve the problem at one level, what about other levels? Now, I think I'm running out of time, so I'll kind of just do this quickly, but we then try to apply some of the theory of governance, of collective intelligence in governance, to the problem of multi-level. In other words, you know, should the national level, the regional level, the local level make these decisions? Should we have, you know, neighbourhood committees who decide pretty much everything? How's it all going to fit together? Now, as part of that, then we said, oh, let's get more systematic about how this governance thing is working. And what we can say in many cases, and this is a simplification, the government system really does not work very well in so many cases. The other stakeholders are disconnected out of that loop. The system itself is, you know, the information has to get from here to there, to up to there, and then across to there, and then down there, and so on. And if the citizens vote every 3 or 4 or 5 years for some person that they never meet, simply on the basis of, you know, newspaper headlines or whatever, this is really not a great kind of feedback on a systematic way. So then we say, okay, maybe there is another way to configure this. And we talk about circles, we talk about co-governance. And indeed, the circle you see here is simply the circle which we saw before on the neighbourhood scale, translated to a city scale or even a national scale. So the circle is then the primary means of doing this stuff. Now, again, that might sound utopian from where we are right now, but we can say, oh, what if we have a large patch of land in the city and everyone's, you know, arguing about what it should be and what to do and who is in charge? You could say, oh, maybe we have this circle and use that as the primary means of communication and forming of synergy, and then scale back up to the people who, you know, have the machinery and the finance and the know-how and so on. But all the time, the circle is the primary means. So this again is then something which translates into the equality question. And again, well, I think we saw this one before, but here's a little cartoon version. Dictatorship and managed elitism, so to say. I have to be, I might, sorry if I give offence to anybody here, by the way, and you can blame me, and you know, and so on. I think SACN, you know, has no responsibility for the content of my talk here, but this is based on observation of the situation in the UK, for one. And then we say, oh, what, you know, is there an alternative? What if we use some different kinds of images? And here we have a tree of life image. And I'll come back to this in about one moment before I stop. And could this be one of the keys? It's not like we expect to solve inequality, you know, tomorrow. It really isn't like that. But we can identify maybe processes, enablers, pathways that lead in the direction of equality over, you know, time. And if this involves transformation of other systems, finance, government, housing, and so on, well, that's how everything has to work together. So, well, I'll skip this one to get to the pathways point, which is then to say, okay, the title of this was Pandemic City 3.0. What the hell is a Pandemic City 3.0? And again, we can kind of take on board this scheme and say, well, the pandemic is disrupting everything. It's amplifying all these problems. It's probably going to make a lot of things worse for many, many people, but it also opens up seeds of opportunity. How can we use that? If we take a technical approach, we have like a 1.0. Well, we do better epidemiology and better public health, and we have more, tests and so on. Great, we all need that. If we take a evolutionary approach, we look to markets, we look to incentives and innovations. But then we could also expect, okay, we're not going to solve inequality or waste or climate change in this way. So we're looking for a evolutionary system. And some funny things coming up on the chat, so we'll look at that later. So the 3.0, well, we look at all this stuff. Housing, innovation, welfare, ecology, governance, culture, they all have seeds. If we know how to put them together and to cultivate them, well, then we have a chance. And then, well, we saw early on this one again, and this was the deeper opportunity multiplier. Well, here's a little plug for my book, actually, so I'll skip that hastily. Meaning, do this and everything could be better. But what is more important here is to say, well, we've talked about deeper threat multipliers, climate change, migration, economic collapse, and so on. What about the deeper opportunity multipliers? So this one, actually, this is work in progress, but it was to say, well, what if we take this tree of life image? What's going on in this tree of life? And in this case, we have, again, it's almost like a game. And there are different games going on. One is a kind of metabolism game. Sunlight and water and carbon are metabolized into this amazing thing. Another game is the support structure game, what I call the development game. You have to build the trunk and the branches and the roots and everything. Not only the physical thing, but the circulation system. And then, most important for us here, I think, is the roots of cooperation, which, well, we can talk about all day, but mutual exchange, social identity, emotional synergy, and many others. And then we can start to say, oh, this is not just a one-off tree, gone for one season. It reproduces, it rejuvenates, it has a kind of life story. How does that work? So, and then, the leaves and the fruit fall off, they compost the ground, the insects get to work, and so on and so on. So that is a kind of very simplistic view of one way to frame these pathways. And then coming back, well, we have a case study actually to discuss shortly. And one way to frame this is to say, well, even in this case study, if we run a kind of program of debate and exploration, well, I'm sure we can see many of these things conveniently labeled in red, so we know that they are, dangerous. And then we say, okay, maybe there is also an equivalent, equal and opposite case for creating opportunity from this crisis, even in this one case study. And this is, a microcosm. But so with that, really, I will leave it there. And that's kind of my collective works, some websites. And thank you so much for hearing me. It's always a great opportunity. And I'm really hoping that we can get some great debates and some interaction, even online, at this moment. And hopefully this will then move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Really appreciate that. And we'll share those links with everybody as well. Somebody was also asking whether they'll be able to see the recording of this later. And so the answer was yes, and I've put that in the chat. So I'm trying to restrain myself from commenting, which is what I'd love to do. I'm a fan of your work. The idea is to get more objective people, I think, to give some feedback and some contextualizing of what you've shared, both at a macro systems view, but also in terms of what processes and options and ideas, the thinking that you're asking us to do. I'd like to invite Amira Osman, our first sort of respondent, and maybe just to let you all know, we've been quite cruel with our respondents. They know they've got very short snippet opportunities, but they will continue to engage throughout. So Amira, I'll just hand over to you for your initial reactions.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Geshe. Thanks, Joe. I've been for a day or two trying to engage with your book and with the concepts you're presenting. And if I understand my role correctly, it's trying to look at how this could possibly apply to our situation here in South Africa. So I've picked out some things. I'll kind of give a general very quickly. I need to put my timer on. I've been told not to speak for too long. First of all, this is really, I haven't read the whole book, but I have read chunks of it. And it is really one of the most ambitious projects I have recently come across. So I just wanted to say that it's almost like you're trying to redesign life itself. And, you know, and I admire that, honestly. In the book, you mention Alexander's pattern language and how you're trying to do something similar in terms of a pathway language. And I think the comparison with Alexander is really relevant. That was also a very ambitious project. And I also then remembered a very old book called Educreation by Paul Rittell, where he also looked at everything to do with education, from the psychology to the policies, to the spaces, to the content. So these are kind of the ambitious projects that came to mind, and yours seemed to fit in there. So even the presentation now, it's incredibly dense, and one starts wondering what are the key points, you know, that need to be mentioned. So I'm going to mention some things that I got from the book. So the complexity and the denseness of this is that you're not just looking at the local, but you're also looking at the global. You're not just looking at rational thinking, but you're looking at emotional, cultural, spiritual. One aspect that I really enjoyed is the mythology aspect. And there's a comment in the book about every culture already having its versions of pathways from smart to wise in their mythology. And that is something that I thought for us in South Africa, in Africa, it's something that we you know, would be useful. And then this transition from clever to smart to wise. And for me, it was a transition from competition to collaboration. And that is something that I really think is incredibly important for us in our context. And the transitioning from spaces of exclusion to places of inclusion through a collective urban intelligence. That for me was incredibly powerful. And then there were a whole lot of applications that you suggested in the book. And I just looked at a few of them. For example, transitioning from smart housing to wiser housing. And I just started thinking about our own subsidy systems and the way that housing finance works in South Africa, and how that transition would really be beneficial for us in South Africa. There was also the fact that you mentioned that wiser planning embraces civic design through dialogue, rather than having a negative, it's my interpretation, rather than having a negative approach to dissent. Now, this for us in South Africa is incredibly important. How do we transition from having this particular approach to dissent, to protest, to anger, and transforming that into something more positive through engagement and dialogue? So I kind of looked at that, transitioning from this form of housing to that form of housing, and then you talk about cities and city regions and economics and governance. You made a comment in your talk about not getting into the politics, but I don't think that what you're saying, and I don't think your book can be anything but political. That's my, so you kind of go there and then you say you don't want to go there, but I think it's a political statement, and that's why I said it's almost like you're designing life itself. One of the things that I enjoy in the presentation and in the book is this two-way interaction between the physical and the human systems. Habraken many years ago said that building is a social act. So you seem to have incredible understanding and appreciation for that. And I think the complexity of what you're proposing is because of this interaction between the physical and the social and the human. Yes, so I have a whole lot of notes here in terms of, mass housing and subsidies and how we could transition into something wiser through what you're proposing. And also in terms of using the pandemic as an opportunity. As I understand it, Joe, this is years of work, but you're taking all of those years of work and trying to apply it to the pandemic situation now. And I see I've just gone over 5 minutes, so I will stop here.
And I'll say don't stop, keep it going in the chat if you'd like to, but thank you so much, Amira, for those reactions and responses. Joe, you'll be able to come back on all of this later if you'd like to. We'll just carry on to Siwe. So Siwe from SACN, welcome to share your reflections. Siwe, are you still awake? Okay, I wonder if we've lost Siwe. I see her on here, but I don't see her coming on. Siwe? Okay, perhaps if we struggle with her, we might just go over to Nosipo. Nosipo, do you mind going next while we see what's happening with Siwe?
Not at all.
Okay, cool. Do you want to turn your camera on, or are you shy?
Let's just do that. Thank you so much, Joe. And I think I would also agree with Amira on her assessment in the sense that it is a very ambitious project that you are taking us through. And the beautiful thing about ambitious projects is that not all of us, we sometimes get stuck in things that are very practical, and very easy to do, and we don't push ourselves or push the boundaries in terms of what can happen. And I also appreciate the fact that there's a very good recognition of that physical and the human interaction throughout, and it's recurring throughout your presentation without underestimating the socio-political dynamics that takes place. But as I was listening to you, there's a few things that I just came to my mind. For some of us who believe in something that says human beings are inherently evil, and at our very core of existence as human beings is to try and satisfy or try and sort ourselves first, then the bigger world out there. It would seem that somehow what we're proposing here is that human beings are actually want to work for the betterment of the world, that they don't have to struggle with this inherent internal urge for them to just service themselves first before they service everyone else. I mean, it comes across even when we talk about planning for real, which is a concept that I really subscribe to, where we're saying that the citizens are at the center of any planning that we are seeking to do. But then at the same time, if you're thinking about the fact that inherently we are evil, inherently those businesses that we're talking about and the politicians that we're talking about are made up of human beings who are likely to seek out their own interest other than the others. So that's the one thing that in my head I was trying to contrast with, and every time we talk about these development initiatives or any other initiatives that comes from anyone, it's to say, who is it trying to service? What's in it for you? And if we can remove that and say, how do we make sure that it's for the greater collective? But the tools of doing that are usually not at disposal, and to try and get everyone to sort of understand or to on the same table to get to the same vision is often very problematic. And another thing is our assumptions on the systems that we have at play. I don't think at any point in time you're assuming that we've got static political systems that don't change. If we use your case study, especially the very second last slides that you were showing us on how we can achieve this 3.0 city. In some instances, yes, initially we may all subscribe to that, but the politics are not static. And it is in the politics, as they often reminded us, they are allowed to change their minds. How then do we make sure that we continue to realize the very great things and very ambitious things that you have presented to us? And then my other reflection is on the right to space, which is something that we struggle with across the globe, various regions. I mean, if you talk to the guys in the US, it's about the immigrants, and they're very specific on who those are. Similarly, in the UK, they've got their own dynamics. It's all about the right to space. And in South Africa, the right to spaces has manifested itself in what has been termed the xenophobic attacks, and all sorts of other things. And while we talk about the right to space and the identities of people to sometimes change people's perceptions of the right to space is a very long-term project. And while we're dealing with that very long-term project, where we may feel that it is right to exclude a particular part of our society from enjoying specific benefits. And I'm using the case of Salvacop, which you've used as your own case study. When we talk about them, there are strong voices that are saying whatever development that's going to take place in Salvacop needs to be prioritized a particular group of people who think that they've got a right to space. So there's layers even to that right to space to say, are you a South African? That's the first thing. Then over and above that, are you a local in terms of Pretoria, and all those other things. So these other dynamics that we are confronted with in terms of determining who has the right to space are some of the things that we need to take into consideration. And I really appreciate what you've presented here. And I think I've exceeded my time. I'm just on time, Geshi. Let me just stop there, but I'll keep it going on the chat.
Thank you. And especially because I think as we get into the interaction, we will talk about the case. And I think that will allow us to test some of these ideas or questions you're raising. We have resuscitated Siwe. Welcome back. Would you like to go?
Sure. I think my sort of perspective is more on someone who's also been working in kind of the same way that Joe has been working, but really your work has taken you 10 years. And what I've been doing is only just over a couple of months, just more on the experimental side of trying to understand how we can bring together different stakeholders from, different sectors of society to reimagine the future city, but in a way that tries to be more sort of ambitiously very creative in the process, and very, I say ambitious because of the way that the project was configured and trying to get, different sectors of people work in different disciplines, who come from all walks of life, and people normally excluded from the conversation. So this is really my sort of inputs are really about that. Is for me the human elements to how you came up with sort of the drawings and the configurations and the reimaginations, because of obviously the different types of politics, and I think the lived experiences of people and how those backgrounds and stories and how people experience the city, how that influences the kind of city they want to see, the kind of city they want to contribute to, and the kind of spaces and communities that they want to be a part of developing. So I was particularly interested in the way that you were speaking about trying to develop a game of how to explore different possibilities in terms of tracking, the sort of your life path based on, who you are and where you come from and the types of decisions that you make based on that. And I think why that really stands out for me is because of the fact that we've been able throughout this process to attract different people who normally wouldn't have these conversations together. There would be, university lecturers, someone who was previously homeless, someone working for a city department, different artists, people like that who normally aren't invited into the conversation. And I think for me, just being part of the process, I guess, of coming up with these visualizations of what the future city could be is this, frustration from people to say, we've contributed all of these ideas, but where is the type of government that can absorb these kinds of ideas? Because another issue for me is that we seem to be operating really on a trust deficit kind of system, where people don't believe that the government will do what they said they would, or that the system doesn't have the capability to absorb the ideas of ordinary citizens, right? So there's been this more push towards, this is from the people that have been attending these sessions, is the push towards more decentralized government, which I think is something that you mentioned also, is the possibility of it being easier to hold a smaller government accountable, a more localized government accountable, and having the higher capability of your ideas or your solutions and your skills being able to affect the community that you come from. So I think, the more human side of it for me is what, really interests me, because of the fact that we can get caught up in this futuristic technology smart kind of city talk, and these, very perfect looking ideas of what the city could be and these different configurations, but understanding that the people within that space have the capability to change the spaces they come from, and to change their political mandates, to change their ideas, and to affect smaller systems in that way. So I think for me, it's the governance system that I would want to see in saying, what is the kind of language then that we want to use to define? What are the different principles of a society that we want to see in this, whatever pandemic city it is, or whatever these future visual manifestations that we come up with. So I think in this understanding of people, if we say we're putting citizens at the center, I don't think it's as static as saying it's civil society and business and youth, for example, but seeing city practitioners, also seeing politicians as those people who are at the center, and understanding the very tough conversations that have to happen between those people and the constant tensions that we have to grapple with. So I think, I'm not sure if I've gone over time, but those are just my initial responses to some of what I've seen. Thanks so much.
No, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Siwe. So I am just thinking, I think that's a great set of reflections, I think, from practice, from people who are trying to do similar things and facing the frustration of using these techniques. I think we've had some intellectual and scope questions. There's some questions in the Q&A, Joe. I don't know if you're seeing those. But what I would like to suggest, because you've all been sitting for an hour, 15 or more, is maybe this is a good time to just take our 5-minute break, which I had promised you and which we think is possibly needed. So you can jump around a bit or pop over to the bathroom, grab a cup of coffee. And maybe when we come back, then Joe, you can decide whether you want to give some quick responses as we then get into the interactive session, where I think even some of the issues we're raising now, we will try to play with through the simulated exercise. I should admit that Joe had preferred that we actually break out into smaller groups and do the interaction that way. It's a bit richer. But there's 30 of us. Hopefully we can manage here in plenary, just because the webinar platform doesn't easily allow us to do that. So if we can just take 5 minutes, and thanks to some great comments coming through on the chat, please feel free to continue doing that. It's 11:13 by my clock, so at 11:17, we can come back online. So quick break, get back in 5. Thanks, everybody.
Around this 12-step thing. But really, it's a toolkit. It's a bag of tools. The builder does not use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order. The builder or carpenter will say, okay, I'll use this for that, this one for that, and the result is there. So this is the short demo version. So then, well, here is our general round table, and you have the same thing more or less on the interactive whiteboard. It's down at the bottom. And what we're basically trying to do is say, who is involved in this? How do they interact? What problems do they bring to the table? Or conflicts or tensions, even. If we had the time, we could map quite elaborate structures of power and money and flow of information from one place to another. Well, all that takes some time to build up. So we can only just kind of try this for the moment. But basically, we're putting different post-it notes, as if it was a real whiteboard, a physical one, around this table. And once we have a good bunch of post-it notes, then we can start to draw lines between them. Now, what could be simpler? And you can see from the little thing down at the bottom, well, here's one we made before on another project. And once you think about it, there is actually quite a lot of different people, even just the government. Well, so we've got local government, we've got national government, maybe provincial or regional government, we've got government agencies, government departments, we've got parastatals, we've got partnerships. We've got consultants who feed government. We've got the technical systems on which government runs its public services, and so on and so on. Which is not to say, oh, let's get hundreds of things onto this picture and then it will be so complex, nobody can do anything. But again, it's a way of beginning to think about the totality of the situation and making sense. One further point, so the red lines here, these represent lines of power or authority in some way, or control via money or other means. And what you tend to find is on this left-hand side of the screen, and this is like the first exercise, 20 minutes or something, you tend to start drawing pictures of systems of hierarchy, of exploitation, of exclusion, and so on. So here are the residents. They're at the end of the line. They complain to local governments, but actually local government can't do much. They have to report to national government. National government reports to landowners, and so on. The landowners feed the financial system. So in this very, very simple picture, the residents get a raw deal. I mean, this is a great generalization, but I think you get the idea. Now, interesting with the Salvacott case study, because it's a moving picture, maybe there's full of opportunity. I got that impression from the case study. There could be great opportunity if we knew how to use it. So here we draw, start to draw links, and maybe we draw new kinds of actors which are needed to make these links really work, like agencies, intermediaries, facilitators, financial halfway house, or social capital organizers, and so on and so on. So again, we could put hundreds of post-it notes on the diagram. Well, I have to be careful, but if anyone has a great idea, please say so, in the next 20 minutes or something. Do we need new kinds of actors? Frequently, yes. How will instruct those actors or give them their job or their remit? Well, it comes from somewhere. It's a complex system. So this would take hours or days or weeks to fully explore, but again, we can kind of start this process. And I'll just say, this kind of map started for me 30 years ago. I was a kind of community planning policy entrepreneur. I was running around London with the notion that we were getting it all wrong. Development was coming in to these post-industrial areas all around the UK, walking all over the community, who were excluded, disempowered, marginalized, etc., etc. And frequently the developers would run into trouble because nobody was on their side, and local government was kind of caught in the middle. So I was saying, oh, let's collaborate, you know, why not? And we started to draw diagrams which were not unlike this 30 years ago to identify different modes of collaboration, different kinds of social housing, different kinds of land tenure, different kinds of infrastructure, political economy, and so on and so on. All very primitive. We're all complete beginners. I think, to be honest, I'm still nearly a complete beginner. But you know, where to start? Well, here's one way to start. So, and there's the example that we saw before, just for the record. And so, okay, when this is worked up, then we can start to be more formal about it, look for different kinds of value chains, be more specific about the problems, be more tangible with ways forward, the pathways, and so on and so on. So again, I'm hoping very much that this exercise now in the next 40 minutes can go somewhere. Well, there's another one on the development process. We'll skip that. Here's the ones I made before. Here's experience from the UK on a similar project, just on a local high street, not far from here. And similar questions come up, you know, and we're using similar means to explore. Where this might go next, well, again, I would like to report on the whiteboard and the discussion, consider the implications, consider whatever follow-up might be useful. And in particular, to look for different kinds of pathways forward. Now, whether this is all about this case study or whether it's others or more generally, I'm completely open to that, but this is where we're at. So, if anyone had urgent questions, please raise them. And well, I think we'll just run the problem mapping and the solution mapping together in the interest of time and simplicity. If you can use, I'll just demonstrate, to draw an arrow, you just drag an arrow onto the screen and you kind of extend it to where you want, like over there. If you want to draw a curve, which is better for the positive synergies, so to say, well, we can draw a curve like that. And I think, you know, most people can cope with that. And of course, you can change the shape of the, the post-it notes. But if you just, I think it should work. If you just click on the screen, you get a standard post-it note, and you type whatever you want. And this takes about 10 seconds maximum. And then, you know, you position it where you want it. I've suggested policy actors, social actors, economics, and so on around the thing. As I mentioned, there's any amount of detail that you can get into if you want to, if we have time. Everybody has a funny name, that's great. Geshe is a visiting horse, I see. It sounds quite romantic. So let's have a go. And it will get messy. I'm fine with that. Obviously, if 30 people are all putting stuff on, then it would get more messy. So the next 10 minutes, in the first stage of problem mapping, just like who is on the scene. Sorry, I just need to reshare my screen. Okay. Okay, and you'll see the kind of the template is over here, just in case anyone wanted to remind themselves. I'll move this demonstration link. As I said, the negative things can be straight lines. The positive thing can be curved lines. And there's a bit of a line looking nice. You can play with it a little bit. And well, you can see, and also, well, you see, there's a little question about scale. We're all just getting the hang of this interactive stuff. But to see the whole board, well, I have to zoom out. And which makes the writing very small. So, but I think on your individual devices, if you want to zoom in, you just zoom in, and you can see the writing, you know, wherever you want. So that's just one of those things. I was myself going to insert a couple more social actors. Yes, yeah. We have a case going in India on the peri-urban project. Which involves with a similar range of problems facing, you know, developments already bypassed by economic forces. So the kids then turn to drugs and intense digital lifestyles. And those two things often go together. So, so we have a similar kind of thing going on here. It's a question how far to involve the kids directly. And then it was a question to say, should we actually identify the drug users and dealers on our map of the stakeholders? And some people said, oh no, that's really problematic, you know, let's, I said, oh, well, if these are a distinct group, they have a game to play, they are people with, you know, they have interests, and what if we do put them on the board? Now, well, then we ran a series of games a year ago in Chennai, in southern India, with a similar thing. Well, this was on site, offline, so, you know, some things are much easier. But again, we played little games with different local areas, and we said, okay, let's pretend that we are representing, you know, a cross-section of stakeholders. So here are the beggars on the street, here are the billionaires in the distance, in the whatever, shiny towers. Here are a whole range of different people in between. In other words, we kind of push out from the conventional grouping of stakeholders. You know, now, I don't know about South Africa. In this part of the world, if the planners are very keen on, you know, public consultation, they're required by law to do public consultation. So they will put a notice up in the library or the shopping centre, you know, saying, oh, public consultation on, you know, plans for this area. And who will read this? Well, you know, interest groups. Some people get very angry because their, you know, house value might go down. Generally, the most marginalised and excluded people, they're not even in the loop. And also some of the most powerful and influential people, they don't bother turning up to a public meeting because, you know, they've got other things to do. The billionaires and so on and so on. I have no problem with billionaires, by the way. If anyone in the audience is a billionaire, I'm on your side. But to say, okay, so somehow we have to get beyond this for, you know, citizen or community participation. Now, this is an ongoing task. I have, you know, I'm sure we all have years of experience trying to do this. I would never say there's a simple answer to a complex problem. But what we can observe is where we find ways to bring in through outreach work, deep engagement work, changing the wavelength, so that, for instance, in the case of the Salvo COP, well, I understand there's a squatter settlement, up there called Baghdad, and conditions are not great in Baghdad. There is no sanitation and not much water, and so on, high unemployment, all the usual things. Well, I'll just say, when I stayed in Chwani, I stayed on the other side of the tracks from this area, so I walked about. So I have a general feel for the city. So we could say, okay, well, let's start with the squatters, people living in the informal settlement, and work back from there, rather than calling a public meeting and, the usual people turn up and many other people don't, because they feel already, they are disempowered and whatever. So this is one way to do it. And now, why should we do that? Well, because then maybe there are advantages and benefits that come up by doing that, which don't come up in the normal run of, public consultation on the local plan kind of meeting. And well, this is what we're, I think, all trying to do. I went through a big thing with digital, really, starting 10 years ago. Oh, okay, yeah, let's just get the map of the area online, and then we have the technology for people to put comments on the map. And then we have all the different layers of the map. And this should be a giant step forward for the whole thing. Well, my experience so far, we're just wrapping up a 3-year project on this, the European thing. Really, the digital is not a great deal of use, and it often gets in the way. Now, here we are doing digital whiteboards, so, I can't criticize what we're doing now, because actually this is the only way. But what our digital projects seem to find was that, yes, we were trying to explore what we saw on the slides like an hour ago. Say, okay, here's a neighborhood where everybody is a stranger and everybody is excluded from everything. And on the other side of the table, there's a neighborhood where everybody is welcome and people look out for each other. And, they manage the through traffic and so on. How to get from the left hand to the right hand side, how to make that transition. So we were trying to use digital means for something which they were really not very suitable for. So then we found, well, we knew this already, but we had to test and research to say, oh, okay, we use the digital where it's useful, but otherwise we have to really practice our deeper engagement. And if that means, researchers hanging around on a street corner or spending time in the local bar or mothers group or teenage graffiti club or whatever it is, have to be there. So, and now we're trying to communicate this back to, policy and research organizations. It's not always easy. So, right, well, I can see a lot of stakeholders are piling up in the mix. This is already looking very interesting. I can't wait to write this up, actually. Maybe in the last 10, 15 minutes, if we can somehow identify possible synergies between different types of people. Now, there's no single best way to do this, but, we can add in new actors, or we can bring in new links. Well, I will do one of this one here. So I suggested, yeah, let's bring the drug dealers in, because until we talk to them, we might have a hard time getting through to the youth. Now, I wanted to connect them to somebody in the cultural sectors, maybe some sort of creative entrepreneur. So I will bring in maybe a different color and shape. Oops. So I'll use, this kind of color and shape for, what I'll call it, and excuse my spelling, but cultural intermediary or something like that. I'll put them up there in the government social sector roughly, and these people might have some better chance of connecting with the drug-taking teenagers, right? I'm just imagining, stuff that might be happening, because it's happening in other case studies that I'm working on. And then let's bring in another loop. So we get these cultural intermediary new people to loop into, now I'm struggling to read the writing now. If that says NGO here, well, this is just purely for demonstration. It's probably all wrong, but you get the idea. So we start to look for links between people who are not already talking to each other. And then we start to say, oh, how do we make this link work for everybody concerned? Now, what we found in our Indian case study that I mentioned was there was a new kind of intermediary, let's call them social ecologists, or social agroecologists. It's a very strong movement in India. And amazingly, they found a way to talk to the disaffected youth who otherwise were getting into drugs and gangs, and somehow they managed to get them into digging out the water bodies, which are all contaminated and out of use. And by doing that, they freed up land for growing. And by doing that, the village, the mothers and fathers could say, hey, this is a really good thing. Our youth can actually, restore some of this land. So now this is then another kind of new one called, let's just call them ecologists for the moment. So for that one, again, this curved thing is not so easy to use, but you get the general idea. So somewhere down here, yeah, we try to connect these cultural people to the ecologists who are then thinking about, the water bodies, the channels, canals, and the hydrology of the growing land, and so on and so on. They are thinking about all this as a system, as they should. So in other words, in that one case study, and these things, again, just for demonstration, I'll kind of take them off the official record of this meeting. This starts to make links which were otherwise very difficult. And then just to follow that through, we say, okay, so now the ecologists have a kind of, food systems plan, and this connects somewhere up to, the mothers, the parents of the drug-taking youth, who now start to feed back positive signals to the youth. In other words, so we start to create a virtuous circle. So this is roughly where we're heading now. Again, one would struggle to, really complete this in the space of a few minutes. But I'm hoping if this method kind of looks halfway promising, well, then we could, at some point, take more time, a more structured process, and come up with basically, a much more tangible and detailed way forward. Any questions, by the way? Sorry, I wasn't checking the chat feed.
I don't see any new ones for now. There's some comments coming through.
Yeah.
So Nasipo, I don't know if you want to verbalize yours or if you want me to mention it. It's a question about the systems, a comment. So it was Nasipo just commenting that understanding the innovation ecology in these places is very useful because we often neglect micro ecosystems of innovation in favor of the macro systems.
Right. I'm struggling to get the chat as well as the screen share.
Sure, no problem. No, I've kind of read it
Can
out
you
to you.
just say what was on the question?
It wasn't a question, it was a comment that understanding the innovation ecology within these spaces is useful because we often neglect the micro ecosystems of innovation in favor of the macro systems. And I think she's building on a point Amira was making earlier about whether one can drive innovation and change at this sort of hyperlocal level if there are systemic obstacles elsewhere. And I was sort of commenting that I think, in a way, that's what I appreciate about this kind of systems thinking, because it's possible to take a nested view of that. So there's always innovation. So people always make a plan and there are always things going on, innovations going on at some scale. Now they can be limited in terms of how far they can go, how effective they can be if other systems aren't working right. I think Nasipo was just building on that to say that it's useful to understand those micro ecosystems as we're beginning to do now.
Absolutely. Well, kind of a one-off responses. You say, yeah, the micro is maybe where we start, but also the macro is needed to enable the micro. And we've all had stories about wonderful things that happen in slum settlements, informal settlements, and then sorry, the bulldozers are coming because in Nairobi, for instance, they had to build a new road. Yeah, that's just how it is. The huge challenge is how to get the macro and the micro working together, and then also on the opposite scale, how to get the public sector interest working with the private sector interest, and maybe a third set of interests which are neither. And I think, previously on the chat, I put up a kind of one-line response about the power stroke systems approach, which is in a very nice book called How Change Happens by Duncan Green. And he points out from experience of many years of kind of development work, the power over is only one version. There's power with, or power within, or power between different groups of people, and so on. Now, that all sounds nice. I would just say you have to be really careful because, the situation can be extremely complex. Now, one example from UK and Europe. So, 10 years ago, we all went into this thing called austerity, and the government was cutting back, laying people off, shrinking its budgets, and so on. And the government said, oh, that's okay because communities, they can do self-help and mutual aid and grassroots action. So we don't need to keep pumping money into these places. They can get their act together themselves, So, and of course, what then transpired over some years was, middle-class educated communities were quite good at helping themselves. After, working class or excluded communities, not always so good for a variety of reasons. Although there are always, success stories and best practices and things that, go on the front page of the report and so on. And same thing for the third sector. So, in the UK, we had this social innovation. It's called food banks. And who would have thought in, one of the top 10 economies of the world, large portions of the population are going hungry, and particularly the children. Now that's a long story, but, you know, so the third sector stepped in and set up food banks, and first they were feeding, you know, like 100,000 people, and then 1 million people, and then 10 million people. What on earth is going on? That, you know, people have to get their food from charity. Now, then you could also turn that around and say, oh, well, in a utopian vision thing, why should they not get their food from charity? You know, is this kind of, you know, another kind of socialism? That to say, well, you know, food does not have to be in the public, in the private sector. Every time I get on a long haul flight, actually, like the one to Joburg, you know, everybody on that flight gets a meal. They don't have to worry about, you know, which is the most expensive. You know, they just get a meal. This is like socialism on the plane. Now, so my point here is, I don't look for kind of simple solutions anymore. And totally, I'm a, you know, grassroots kind of guy myself. That's how I started in life. So, you know, it certainly all begins at the grassroots, but then you have to work at other levels to enable that grassroots to flourish, and then you have to look for the coordination between the grassroots and other levels. This all then comes up in the case study, which, if I understand it, it's not only about, oh, what is the best kind of development shall we build in this place? It's under that, it's about who has a claim on this place, who has the right to be there, or the right to use, you know, this very nice site, you know, very close to the city centre and close to the park, and so on. Again, it raises questions which are not easy. If we say, oh, as our government would now do, oh, let the market decide, you know, anything else is just going to get messy. So they let the market decide, they, you know, deregulate, cut the red tape, and so on. And the negative impacts are growing every day from that kind of approach. If we say, oh, the public sector should decide, well, we all know the public sector is very far from perfect. Different departments, they can't talk to each other, there are power struggles inside, there is a knowledge system problem. Another time I could expand on that, but to say, oh, from our example here in Manchester, everybody wants the citizens to participate and be part of this thing, but who the hell can understand how urban planning works or transport, you know, policy and planning works? So complex. So this is then, you know, it's not just a kind of detail, it's a major, major problem. Anyway, so broadly, you know, my take on the case study, and maybe in the final, you know, quarter hour, we can kind of air this jointly. My take is to say, oh, this is an ideal opportunity, maybe, to put together not one round table, but a series of round tables, look for the synergies and the potential opportunities and values between different actors, and maybe this map on the screen can be some, you know, starting point for that. I'm sure we'll have to do it again, you know, a number of times, but at least, you know, here's a starting point. And explore the boundaries of what is possible. Now, I'll just finish my piece with one example. So I'm working on a situation in inner London, actually, where land values are sky high. This is just round the back of King's Cross Station, if anyone knows London. And the local municipality, Camden, is quite left-wing. They want social housing. How do they get it? Under a right-wing government. So the community has formed a land trust, you know, like a third sector thing, with the help of my friend who is working there. The community is now bidding for this development of total value, 800 million, you know, it's kind of big stuff. And they're trying to create the world's most sustainable high-density urban development. Great. And they are trying to engineer not just, you know, the physical development, but a social mix which is exemplary. In other words, no, sorry, not a social mix only, but a social and governance structure for owning, managing, improving, designing, running the services, and so on and so on. So this is kind of, you know, cooperative action on the front line. We're not all complete beginners. Some of us have been trying this for 40 years. But the particular mix right now, this is new, you know, and it has to respond to what is in front of us. So I'll report back on that next time. So Geshe, should we move to, you know, a plenary discussion and feedback?
Yes, I think that would be good. There's been some chatting going on the side, but maybe we could, and I think thank you for just recognizing and giving us this little dipstick experience, but also acknowledging that obviously this is a process, as you said, you would normally carry over a couple of days and go deeper, but hopefully people playing with that a little bit gave a bit of insight. I don't know, Joe, if you want to have a look. There were a couple of questions from earlier that were in the Q&A that are still relevant. I don't know if you're able to access that or if you need me to read them out.
We have to stop the share and get to the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then in the meantime, I'll just welcome if anybody else has any. We're down to our last 15 minutes of the time we promised. I see a few people have had to leave now. If you do have any additional questions, pop them in and we'll share all of this back. And thank you. I see people are continuing to chat. But Joe, if you maybe want to come to, there's a question from Rihanna about Theory U and the relationship she sees to this work. And I think also perhaps maybe reinforcing the point Nasipo was also making about the state of mind of actors in the space as well. And then Danga has a broader question about just, more generally, so you're coming from the UK context and how you might see these kinds of processes playing out in ours. So those are two questions. Sadhna is also just prodding everybody. If and when you leave, please do jot an evaluation. The feedback's useful. But Joe, responses?
Well, let's say I'm getting a bit of a sore throat. Could one or two of the other panelists respond to some of these very interesting questions at this moment? That would be a nice way to do it, I think.
Sure. So maybe, I don't know if all the panelists actually want to come face live, and we can have these last 15 minutes, a bit of an engagement so that Joe's throat can recover.
Well, I'm just reading this question from Nasifa. Power dynamics and the assigned games that we are seen to play are also an issue. Yes. Communities play identity games only? Not really. We may just play different games at different times depending on the roles or objectives we want to achieve at a particular point in time. I agree with everything there. And then my question back is, okay, so how to work with this, how to move forward? Can you suggest examples or ideas on this? So that's one question, I guess, back to Nosifo. And, well, a question from Amira, I think following up the previous. Micro and macro is an interesting topic in South Africa. We also need a major overhaul in order to address apartheid planning. Yeah. Not undermining local innovations by investing in townships and being innovating in townships. You may just be reinforcing spatial segregation. Well, yes. I think this is my point about getting the micro and the macro to work together. If we just say to the townships, oh, okay, fine, you do your social innovation, that would be nice. Then actually, you know, the spatial segregation continues or increases. Now, this is such a hard challenge. Would other people like to respond to this?
So the panelists can respond vocally or verbally if you'd like. Other participants would have to comment in the chat. Sorry.
Geshe, can I just say something?
Please, Amira, go for it.
Yes, so when I ask these questions, please don't think I have the answers. So that's a disclaimer. It's stuff that I struggle with. And for example, when we look at all of these big developments happening at Salvakop, the government facilities, the museum, Freedom Park, when I think of systemic change, I think like when you get a approval to implement that development, there need to be conditions with it, that you need to do X, Y, and Z in the context for you. And that's where government can have a hold on the transformation that should happen in those areas. That's just a suggestion. But I do acknowledge and understand that within the parameters of a specific site, you can have a lot of innovations. And I think individual designers, actors at that level have a moral obligation to take things into consideration. But more than the moral obligation, we also need to reinforce systems that make those big developers address some issues in that context. So, but a lot of the questions I ask are really, they're questions that I'm grappling with as well.
I kind of guessed that. Well, we're all grappling, right? We're all kind of beginners actually on these most important things. I'll just say, well, from previous experience in this part of the world, one approach is to say, oh, let's force the developers to get more social housing in and make sure that is mixed and, according to our criteria and so on. Yes, but that is very difficult. It often falls short and so on. There is more sometimes to be gained where we say, oh, maybe there is scope for a kind of third sector kind of approach to land, tenure, security, stewardship, investment, which builds on social capital, and so on and so on. Just one example, yesterday, in Scotland, you might know that Scotland is one of the most unequal societies in terms of land ownership. But now there is a kind of push from national government and local government, which the owners of these huge areas of land are beginning to respond to, because they then have the people, the local people saying, yeah, actually, we want to buy this land which surrounds our village or our town. So when the pressure comes from all sides, and also then there are opportunities coming from all sides, and the villagers say, yeah, sell us this land and then we will look after it and we will do you a big favor because, it's improving your other things and so on and so on. In other words, all the time you have to look for the positives, the synergies. Well, same thing on the example in London. Well, not to say that, that's the answer and it's all going to be straightforward. It's not the case. Now, segregation, well, formal segregation in this part of the world is a major issue, but maybe not the number one national issue. What we do have is let's say an intersectionality of segregation. So there is class, there is education, there is urban versus rural, the racial and colour divides kind of cut right across that somehow. But we do know also that the pandemic is, making the divisions worse for a variety of reasons. We have a resurgence of extremism now in Manchester due to the pandemic being the cases being concentrated in areas of high migrant population, and so on and so on. So these are very real issues. Now, all I can say is where we can see examples of things that worked, and the one which I quote somewhere in my book, I think in social chapter, if you ever get to it, is to say, oh, actually, 3 years ago, a bomb went off in Manchester, killed dozens of people, most of them young people, It was a radical Muslim extremist. And at that point, I was thinking, oh my God, the city is going to fall apart, you know, with racial riots and God knows what. Instead, the opposite happened. The city came together. The mosques opened up their doors, say, yeah, come in, we are peaceful people, you know, come and have lunch, and so on. And the churches and the synagogues and the temples and so on and so on. In other words, the potential for racial conflict, or, you know, racial and religious conflict, somehow turned around just in a few days into trust and cooperation building. Now, I'm not saying, oh, you know, do it like Manchester, everything will be fine, but it's one example. You look for the positives and the seeds of what is positive, and then think about how to grow those. Does that make sense?
I had, you know, a thought about what Amira was saying in terms of the type of development and how it happens in townships, and if that can end up reinforcing, you know, spatial inequality. I think I don't necessarily think there's like a blanket approach to doing that or not doing it in a way that won't reinforce inequalities. I think lots of townships across the country are very different from each other. And some are better located than others, some are better equipped than others, and some have development that happens better than in other cases. But I think for most of, at least my experience and what I've witnessed is the way that development happens is that it's not necessarily happening in townships, but it's happening to them. So it's almost like it's already been decided, and we apply the same sort of development methodologies in the city as it is to the township. You build and then expect that, you know, developments will happen in that way. So I think the type of development models that we have for townships is currently reinforcing that. But I think in a way, you know, I think the leadership needs to be very decisive on the parameters of how development should happen in townships and appeal to not necessarily the moral standing of developers, but I think the decision-making structures in the city also have to be very intentional about, you know, who gets to develop and how that development happens, because I don't think we can talk about spatial transformation without talking about townships. I think that's really the place that is still one of the biggest legacies that we have to live with. So I'm just one of the people who really thinks that's exactly the place that we need to focus on because of the inherent linkages that it still has to the city. And I don't think that we can escape that relationship, whether it remains unequal or we somehow manage to transform it.
Yeah. Well, I'll just comment. It made me think of my personal experience when I was a community architect on the job, so to say. I was working in a place in North Manchester. Well, here we don't have townships, but we have estates, you know, where basically the poor and the excluded were dumped, you know. Some of them are inner city, those are mostly cleared now. Many of them are outer city, so similar thing, long way from services, jobs, etc. The social mix is often a recipe for conflict and tension. So I got to this estate somewhere in north of Manchester. I was working for the local authority as an architect. And my brief was to improve this estate. Plant some trees and, you know, clear up the broken glass, you know, this kind of thing. Well, with my head full of ideas. So I got talking to people, and the first thing I find is the estate is a mess physically, but it's even more of a mess, you know, socially. I mean, to be honest. And the old people are scared of the young people, and the new people are scared of the old people, and the business people are scared of the yellow people are scared of the white people, and so on and so on. Divisions all around. And while there were these divisions, it was impossible to call a meeting and say, oh, let's, you know, plant some trees and have a nice improvement. So I began on this thing, which was way outside of my job description, I have to say. But, you know, it seemed like the right thing to do, to organize, you know, meetings, forums, assemblies, block groups in each of the tower blocks, you know, and so on. Gradually, again, before any of this theory existed, I had no PowerPoints or anything, but, you know, we were just kind of feeling our way. Now, what was then the issue was to say, well, we can talk about the physical improvements, and this was the agenda of the local municipality and the developers, which say, oh, here's a nice area of land. If we could just clear away the people, we can build some high-value housing or offices or something, you know, same old story. So again, then we have to say, oh, the people are not just people, you know, to be shunted around. You know, here is a list of all their groups and all of their activities and all of their projects and all of their mutual aid things and their networks and so on. So gradually, again, with, you know, this is all pre-digital, so it was very slow and painful. We built up a kind of atlas of what was going on in that place. And then, as part of that, people say, oh, maybe we don't have to be so afraid of the, you know, the drug-taking teenagers, because actually, you know, they came to our meeting last week. They're not so bad, really. And maybe someday or other they'll stop, you know, they'll come off the drugs. Who knows? And so on. In other words, you have to look for any which way to start building those bridges. And if you can do that, then this, you know, deprived estate, which is all a huge problem in the eyes of the policymakers, and everybody else on welfare, and the police go and arrest people regularly, and so on. We start to help this place to, you know, turn itself around. Now, a long story, and that's just a simple summary, but I think, you know, this is the way to go. If we have top-down policies for spatial segregation, well, it's bound to, you know, be problematic in my experience so far. So the grassroots, as one of us was saying a while ago, is often the best place you start, but then we need the top-down to respond and enable and open these doors and so on. And if then there is a development proposition, which might be the case in Salvo Cop, I'm not sure, then we say, oh, by the way, you know, this place really needs social development with a mutualized financial structure, with a cooperative land holding system, with this and that, you know, and then all these things should be on the table, ready to roll. Well, over to you.
So I actually wanted to get us towards closure, because I think there's lots of ideas that have been shared and raised here. I just want to look around to the panelists to see if anybody wishes to say a final word before I kind of close it out. Amira, are you good? Do you want to say anything? You're fine. Siwe, how are you feeling? Nasipo, you're good. Joe, how are you feeling? How's the throat?
Great. A very nice, very stimulating session. And well, my only worry is that I was talking too much.
Well, we invited you to speak, so we expected that. Thank you for that.
If there is a next time, I would like to do some more listening, actually. Yeah, sure. So
it's always the challenge, I think, with these online calls, because when we started talking to Joe, we were talking about a 1 hour session, then we got to a 1.5 hour session, we got to 2.5 hour session, and you realize that there's a real limit as to how much you can do online, just because you can't keep people that long. So thank you for those of you who've stayed. I hope what you've all experienced today is partly what I really enjoy about Joe's work. Amira referred to it as redesigning life itself. And I think there's a part of this that really is that. But what I do enjoy about it is perhaps, I think, the mix of the way you speak through things, Joe, in a way that is up there, but always gets down to very practical stuff that you've been doing, whether it's the street party or the project that happened or the engagement. So I think And perhaps the systems approach is useful for that as well, because you can do that kind of nesting. You can scale all the way up to really global questions and issues, but really get quite down to the level of a project or an intervention or a decision. Rihanna is reminding us all here about this also being about our internal states and our motives and our approaches to things, the head and the heart. And I love that it's possible to do that. The tools you've begun to show us that I think begin to show us, and in your outputs as well, the possibility of collaboratively generating a set of visuals that enable a discourse. They don't necessarily solve the things, but they allow you to have a particular kind of conversation. I always find your sketches very evocative in that sense. You talked about the need for thinking, that's where we're going to have to start. And I think for those of you who might have felt that today was a bit of going back even to some of the participatory processes we knew, but the recognition that perhaps we still need them, perhaps we weren't wrong, and perhaps we weren't done with participation, perhaps that's the only way forward. And so the ability to revisit and evolve these tools in the ways that Joe is doing, I think is quite important and promising for us. So thank you for this. I think it was an important social, but as others acknowledge, also political commentary about the big as well as the small. For those of you, I must boast now that I have my copy. So the mailing service does work, and thanks to Joe for facilitating that. But for those of you who are interested in getting Joe's book, we've put the link on the chat. Amira has successfully purchased an ebook, so we know that's possible. Joe's also very sharing, so please feel free to engage him via the website. He shared those earlier, and I'm sure you can pop those into the chat again, Joe, if you'd like. There is a series of additional sessions and events that he'll be holding, and I do hope this is not the last time that we engage with you as well, Joe. I think as we begin to think about what are these conversations we need to have and what are the tools that enable us to do that, and you know, I mean, some of these things, you know, they don't go away. The need to participate is not a once-off. The questions of how you do it better will continuously be there. And so I just want to, with those many words, thank you, Joe, for your time and for your book and your contributions to our thinking and working. Amira, thank you so much. Siwe, thank you, and all the best. We look forward to seeing your project and how you engage. And I'm sure you'll be hit with all of these same questions about how is this going to change anything. But I think it does start from the thinking. So, well done, and all the best with your visualization work. Nasipo, my dear, I think everybody is saying it all comes down to you. So. No, I'm kind of joking, but thank you so much. I think it's really important when we have these kinds of conversations that it's possible to ground them with, in a way, those who are holding us. And so thank you to you and the City of Tshwane for continuing to do that. I just want to thank Jeff, my co-collaborator here, and to Kamantha and Sadhna, who've been doing the tech on this in the background and helping to administrate. And then to all of the attendees, please keep engaging. Give us your feedback on Sadhna's evaluation. Let us know if you want to do more of this and what we could do better. There was a big question that Danga had asked, but hopefully indirectly, we've maybe responded to it. You know, this idea of how do we take on, if you want, some of these lessons and avoid the path that may have gotten, you know, other the north to where it is, and maybe this idea of using the pandemic, the virus as the lens to look at our city, maybe begins to do that. So thank you, everybody. Go well, and yeah, let's keep working.
Thanks, Kashi.